Life on Earth has been nearly annihilated 5 major times. Hey everyone, welcome back. Previously we discussed the disaster in the Devonian, and today we're touching on the big boy, the Permian. Now, the Devonian was strange both in its extreme duration and this weird role that emerging plants played in the annihilation of everything else, but the Permian is another animal entirely. For those of you who don't know, who aren't up to date on all the hip extinction lingo, the Permian has affectionately been dubbed the Great Dying due to the sheer impact that it had on ecosystems just around the entire globe at that time period. This is the closest that life has come to complete eradication ever. So you might be thinking, total eradication? Wow, that sounds like a lot. How much is that really? And the answer is 96% of life on planet Earth. This period of time, this Permian extinction, was a complete sterilization. It was, in effect, a perfect storm of geologic and geochemical events that spelled sheer doom for anything that was alive on the surface of the planet. So let's talk about what happened and why it happened.
See how the surf hit the ground, and they give it all they've got, and they give it all they've got, and you give it all you've got, till you're down. See how the brain plays around, and you fall inside a hole you couldn't see. And you fall inside a hole inside of someone. Help me understand what's going on inside my mind. Doctor, I can't tell if I'm not me.
Things were going pretty well after the Devonian extinction. Some of the tetrapods that had emerged from the seas had split into the groups that would become the reptiles and the mammals. Temnospondyls and amphibians too were thriving. This may have been partially due thanks to the enormous sizes that the arthropods of the Carboniferous were growing to. By the time the Permian arrived, a whole new host of strange forms were already lumbering across the planet. In order to fully appreciate the extinction of the Permian itself, we first must pay homage to this strange cast of characters that ruled the ancient world before the more photogenic dinosaurs had even begun their reign. Our tetrapod friends had even further diversified. The amniotes saw the emergence of 2 new groups, the synapsids, who are members of our own line, and the sauropsids, who would yield the reptiles and eventually the birds. The former group would be classified by a single opening in the back of the skull, while the latter consisted of either 2 openings or no opening at all. Our relatives would consist of a line of increasingly strange animals that would be nearly wiped from existence in the coming disaster. These guys were somewhat reptilian in their original forms, lacking hair of any kind, as well as the characteristic inner ear bones that mammals today utilize. A sprawling stance was more common, and tails dragged behind in the dirt. Archaeothyrus and Dimetrodon lurked in this early period, with the first mammalian hints existing in teeth that were beginning to specialize. This is known as heterodontia, or different teeth. We also see the incredibly memeable Cotylorhynchus.
Wait till you see the. No. Look at the top of his head. Look at his lips.
The pelycosaurs emerged soon after, with oddballs such as the sphenacodontids. Therapsids are their own incredibly diverse bunch and are composed of equally bizarre herbivores and carnivores. Eotitanosuchus, the dinocephalids such as Tepinocephalia and Titanophoeus, as well as the amonodontids in Kingoria, all lumbered across the land. The swift apex predator of the end of the Permian would have to be the members of Theriodontia, the gorgonopsids. The sauropsids, some of which were ancestors of the dinosaurs, were represented in this time by thundering para-reptiles such as periosauromorphids and the procholophonoids, as well as the small and unassuming araeoschelids. All of these animals, and indeed far more, ruled the ancient supercontinent of Pangaea. From the lush coasts to the strikingly arid interior, strange beasts trundled across the land. And in the seas, reefs reclaimed a brand new heyday along with the lingering trilobites and some sea scorpions that had managed to eke out a living, sneaking under the gaze of the Devonian and Ordovician extinctions alike. Where North America blended into Africa, an enormous mountain range sprawled from the east to the west, potentially contributing to some of these wildly dramatic temperature swings felt by the interior of the supercontinent. Meanwhile, Panthalassa, the super ocean of this time period, stretched across the remainder of the globe. As is eerily typical for extinction events, the first step is typically injecting massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, and where better to get such enormous outgassings than by blowing Russia to smithereens? The volcanism of the Permian simply dwarfs any concept of eruptions that we have today. We can picture volcanoes, but they end up looking very much like the Mount St. Helens or Vesuvius events, catastrophic but pitifully local events. The best we can do is look to the landmass-forming volcanoes of Hawaii and similar archipelagos. The city-sized impact zones of modern volcanoes are utterly pathetic in the face of the Siberian traps. 252 million years ago, they simply turned inside out. The rock dated to this time period and covering some 2 million square miles of modern-day Russia is known as Continental flood basalt. This kind of rock is formed when a catastrophically large eruption or series of eruptions causes magma to burble to the surface of the Earth and cover a ridiculous surface of land in molten lava. So what exactly does this rock tell us? That a patch of land the size of the modern continental United States was submerged 1.5 miles deep in some areas and 2.5 miles deep in others in lava. This was a literal sea of fire, ash, and molten rock. Because the real estate could not have been worse for this literal hellscape to take up residence. The area of Permian Russia that these volcanoes were forming in is known as the Tunguska Basin, a series of rock strata formed by shale, carbonate, coal, and other very flammable substances that result from millions of years of decomposing forest. In fact, this is one of the largest deposits we have found of coal, spanning 12 kilometers of Earth's crust. So what happens exactly when you inject roiling hot magma into a coal seam that is as wide as America and about 12 kilometers thick? You get the largest detonation seen in the history of our planet. The very land the ancient fauna stood on just exploded. This absolutely apocalyptic misfortune would be merely the first domino in the extinction to end all extinctions. When volcanoes explode, there's a classic nasty side effect. All of these greenhouse gases end up spewing forth with all that liquid hell. And if you'll recall, this problem can be mitigated by the weathering of volcanic rock that ends up sequestering in the shells of sea life. But there is no mountain range large enough to quickly counter what is essentially the ignition of a medium-sized country. In The Ends of the World, Peter Brannan notes that if we were to burn up every single fossil fuel we could get our hands on, we would release around 5,000 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere all at once, and this would essentially bring the sea level up by about 200 feet and scorch large parts of the planet thanks to global climate change. The estimates for the end Permian double that at 10,000 gigatons. To quote from his book, In the Karoo Desert, as rivers stopped winding and insects stopped buzzing and mass death swept over the land, the temperature may have jumped as much as 16 degrees Celsius. On Pangaea, the 140-degree Fahrenheit heat waves would not have been unusual. In the tropics, ocean temperatures skyrocketed from 25 degrees Celsius, similar to today's oceans, to perhaps upwards of 40 degrees Celsius, or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the temperature of a hot tub, or as end Permian expert Paul Wignall puts it, that of a very hot soup. Multicellular life simply cannot exist in this sort of globe-spanning jacuzzi. The complex proteins of life begin to denature. That is, they cook. The language of academic papers is typically measured and sober, but even the peer-reviewed science literature describes the early Triassic period that followed the worst mass extinction ever as a post-apocalyptic greenhouse. End quote. Volcanic eruptions of normal size also release highly toxic chemicals that tend to disperse and be only mildly problematic. Blowing up a chunk of the planet and covering it with lava releases a touch more than that. The atmosphere, alongside the typical greenhouse gases, would have seen a surge in halogenated butane, methyl bromide, and methyl chloride, which sear the ozone layer right out of existence. University of Oslo geologist Henrik Svensson notes that this allows for UVB radiation to seep into the atmosphere and irradiate life on the spot. This is further supported by UC Berkeley paleobotanist Cynthia Louie, who has shown that spores and pollen grains found from the end Permian are abominably misshapen. This mutative effect may not have obliterated plants outright, but the Permian had more to give. All of that CO2 assisted in upping the pH of the seas by 30%, destroying the ability of organisms to utilize calcium carbonate properly. This would lead to sweeping extinctions in the shelled creatures of the sea. Stanford University's Jonathan Payne, in an interview with Peter Brannon, remarks that CO2 in our atmosphere today has jumped from 300 ppm to around 412 ppm in a very short amount of time. The climate scientists are of course concerned, as the typical range for CO2 in our world has been around 200 to 280 ppm. Payne gives staggering numbers. In the Permian, he suggests that the CO2 reached a range of 3,000 to 30,000 ppm. That's about 10 to 100 times the range that we see today, and Payne is leaning more towards the higher end. This world would have looked more like Venus than Earth at some points. So the weathering that would have occurred would have sped up as the cycle recapitulated itself, very slowly beginning the process of resequestering carbon back into the rocks of the Earth. But even with extremely acidified rain, this can only happen so fast. All the while, the hellish domino effect just keeps on coming. There is a pigment found in the rocks dated to the end Permian that is essentially residue from the photosynthetic behavior of green sulfur bacteria. This organism requires some rather rank conditions to thrive, namely sunlight, anoxic waters, and hydrogen sulfide. That last little guy is known for being poisonous as all get out. Some have suggested that these polluted waters, chock full of hydrogen sulfide, essentially suffocated sea life and indeed choked out some terrestrial coastal species as well with noxious fumes. But there are a myriad of different hypotheses out there to explain various end Permian signatures, and most of them likely played a role of some sort. Lethal acid rain resulting from all that CO2 in the atmosphere may have decimated forests in tandem with mercury toxicity and numerous volcanic gases still seeping from the crust of the Earth. All of these factors plays assist to the detonation of Russia and total acidification of the oceans to varying degrees, although the impact of each role is still under investigation. Lee Kump of Penn State once suggested that bubbles of that hydrogen sulfide belched from the surface of nearly stagnant coasts and choked out entire terrestrial ecosystems, but modern modeling of those conditions suggests that this is highly unlikely to be a huge player in the mass extinction of most terrestrial species. That being said, Kump has been up to no good in the geoscience labs, inputting current data of what we think the end Permian conditions would have been like in order to generate what the weather patterns may have been. And the computers have been generating hypercanes. Not hurricanes, not megacanes, hypercanes. These disasters are thought to have been caused by the ungodly conditions only found at the end Permian, such as the ridiculous temperatures seen in the oceans and in the air. These hypercanes are shown in simulation to have 500-mile-per-hour winds, 200 miles faster than any tornado or hurricane measured today. Under simulation, they are capable of crossing entire continents intact, and the water that they're made from is that same toxic CO2 hydrogen sulfide water. They're poisonous hypercanes. I'll let that settle while I read another passage from Brannon's book that summarizes the entirety of this inconceivably horrific extinction event. To summarize, there was an ocean that was rapidly acidifying, one that, over huge swaths of the planet, was as hot as a jacuzzi and completely bereft of oxygen. There were sickly tides suffused with so much carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide that either poison would have sufficed as a killer in its own right. There was a Russian landscape detonating and being smothered in lava several miles deep. There was a fog of neurotoxins and lethal smog steaming from these volcanoes, and high above, an ozone layer blasted apart by halocarbons, inviting a bath of lethal radiation at the planet's surface. There was forest-destroying acid rain, a landscape so barren that rivers had simply stopped winding. There were carbon dioxide levels so high and global warming so intense that much of the Earth had become too hot even for insects. And now there was Kump's unearthly mega hurricanes made of poison swamp gas that would have towered into the heavens and obliterated entire continents. End quote. Life would sputter and nearly flatline. The Permian took 96% of life on the planet, decimating biodiversity and sanitizing entire land masses. Death struggled to choke the air, finding competition in the stifling volcanic gases that hung in the fitful wind and cooked the planet. Life that did survive this mass extinction did so not by wit or strength, but by sheer luck and perhaps a propensity to adapt. However, those that did would bring an end to the entire Paleozoic period, emerging from their dusty dens, isolated caves, and distant seas to ring in the Mesozoic. Their bleak eyes took in a decimated landscape, and their lungs struggled to pull air from the smothered and superheated atmosphere. But the air was cooling, and the seas were beginning to recover. Life had somehow managed to limp its way through the end Permian extinction event. Our relatives had been thoroughly yeeted from their pedestal, and the mammals of the coming years would find themselves skittering about under the thundering feet of the new rulers of the biosphere. The Triassic had arrived, and there was a new game in town, the dinosaurs. Their rule would be long and prosperous, but they were nearly shut down right at the starting gate. The end Triassic extinction was primed and ready to kick life while it was down. All next time on Earth's Extinctions.